Chapter 1. The Power of the Printed Word. The big question? Why was Gutenberg's invention of a printing press so important? Did you know that a man named John Gooseflesh changed the world? Johann Gensfleisch, which in English is John Gooseflesh, was born in the city of Mainz, Germany, around 1397 CE. However, by the time Johann started school, he went by the name Gutenberg instead of Gensfleisch, and that is the name we remember. Gutenberg was the name of the large manor house in which Johann grew up. He came from a very wealthy family. Johann was taught to read from an early age. Unlike the homes of less privileged children in the early 1400s, the Gutenberg house was full of books. That may not seem unusual, but it was. Books in the 1400s were very different from the books we have today. The book you are reading right now is a printed book. There are thousands of copies of this book, all exactly the same. They were printed by machines in a very short time. Not so with the books in Johann's day. Each book in the Gutenberg's home library was one of a kind, rare, and expensive. Books in the Middle Ages. Throughout the Middle Ages, books were made by hand. Much of the writing was done by monks working in monasteries, although the craft of making books also took place in some universities and secular schools. Primarily existing books such as the Bible and great works authored by ancient Greek and Roman scholars were copied. The monks painstakingly copied the text with pen and ink on thin sheets of parchment. It typically took monks many weeks or months to complete the pages of an entire book. The highest quality books were illustrated. This task was accomplished by a skilled artist called an illuminator. An illuminator decorated the pages with colorful, ornate designs and small pictures. Bits of gold, pounded very thin, were applied to the pages of the most expensive books to make the text and illustrations shine. When the manuscript was finished, the final step was to bind the pages into a book. This was done by sewing them together along one side and then sandwiching them between wooden boards covered with cloth or leather. An enormous amount of time and effort went into creating each book. Only the wealthiest members of society, scholars, and church clergy could afford to own such treasures. Throughout the Middle Ages, of course, these were typically the only people who were able to read. Lead and letters. When Johann Gutenberg finished school, he went to work at the mint in Mainz. His father was in charge of the mint, which coined money for the city. Johann learned how to melt and cast metal in molds to form precise shapes. He liked working with metal, and he was skilled at metal casting. As Johann Gutenberg grew older and became a master metalsmith, he thought a lot about the growing demand for books. His experience working with metal gave him an idea. What if he cast letters out of a metal such as lead? He could arrange those metal letters, or pieces of type, in lines to spell out words, make sentences, and create entire pages of text. By applying ink to the surface of the type and pressing paper onto it, he could print those pages. Gutenberg set out to try. First, he developed a way to pour melted lead into molds in the shapes of the letters of the alphabet. Each letter, piece of type, was cast as a mirror image of how it would look when printed. For example, R was cast as a backwards R, and C was cast as a backwards C. Gutenberg made many copies of each letter, both capital and lowercase, plus every punctuation mark. Because his collection of metal type was made up of individual pieces that could be moved around to form endless combinations of letters, it was called movable type. Gutenberg didn't truly invent movable type. The Chinese and Koreans had used a form of movable type hundreds of years earlier. he didn't invent printing either. Different printing techniques had also existed for centuries. In Europe, people had begun printing with ink on paper using blocks of wood. This technique, called woodblock or woodcut printing, began around 1400 CE. The surface of a block of wood was carved to create raised letters and images. Ink was then applied to the carved surface. Finally, the block was pressed onto paper to make a print. If you've ever pressed your thumb onto an ink pad and then touched it to paper, you've created a thumbprint in much the same way. Woodblock printing was a complex and time-consuming process. It wasn't much faster than copying pages of text by hand. What Johann Gutenberg did invent was a machine that greatly improved the process of printing with movable type. He may have gotten the idea for his press from a wine press, a machine used to press the juice out of grapes. Gutenberg's printing press worked in a similar way. Instead of squeezing grapes, though, his press squeezed paper against the inked surface of metal type to make a clear, dark imprint of words on paper. Once he had perfected both his metal type and his press, he was able to print, with help from a number of assistants, several hundred pages a day. Gutenberg's Bible. After experimenting with printing a few official documents and small, simple books of grammar, Gutenberg was ready to undertake a big project. He decided to print a large, beautiful Bible. He hoped to make a lot of money. Gutenberg started printing his Bible around 1450 CE. He may have cast more than 100,000 pieces of type for it. Several times during the process, he ran out of money and had to borrow more. He completed the first edition of roughly 180 copies of the Bible, the exact number isn't really known, in 1454 or 1455 CE. Gutenberg's Bible was the first large book printed with movable metal type in Europe. The power of communication. Gutenberg didn't make much money from his Bible or his new printing process. But as you read at the beginning of this chapter, he did change the world. Gutenberg's printing press and the availability of inexpensive paper made it possible to produce many copies of books and documents quickly. This dramatically lowered the price of books and other printed materials. Suddenly, people had a way to distribute ideas and information from person to person and place to place much faster than ever before. Soon, printing presses just like Gutenberg's were producing hundreds and then thousands of books in cities throughout Europe. At first, most books were printed in Latin, but it wasn't long before books were being printed in more familiar languages, including French, English, Italian, Spanish, and German. At this time, too, literacy, or the ability to read and write, increased across Europe. A growing middle class of merchants and craftsmen gained both wealth and influence. Learning to read and write became something more and more people wanted and needed to do. As a result, the demand for books increased. Books and other printed materials were more readily available for those people who could read. Today, you can walk into a library or bookstore and choose from thousands of books. You can download books from the internet to laptops, tablets, and phones. So you have to use your imagination to really appreciate just how big a change Gutenberg and his printing press brought about. Before Gutenberg, very few people had ever held, let alone read, a book. After Gutenberg, books were much more common. Gutenberg's printing press revolutionized communication, much like the internet revolutionized how people communicated in the second half of the 1900s, although at not quite the same lightning speed. Plentiful, affordable books opened the door to a whole new world of learning and ideas. Some people didn't like this turn of events, however. Some government officials worried, What if printing presses are used to spread ideas that weaken our power over the people? Some leaders of the Catholic Church thought, what if the presses are used to publish ideas that contradict church doctrine? But no one could stop the presses and the sudden flow of information and ideas. It is true to say that Gutenberg revolutionized communication, and just as some political and religious leaders feared, big changes certainly did lie ahead. Upper and lowercase. Have you ever heard someone call capital letters uppercase letters or small letters lowercase letters? These terms got their start in early printing shops like Gutenberg's. A person called a typesetter arranged the individual pieces of type into the whole block of type that would be printed to create a page of text. This person grabbed pieces of type from two boxes or cases, usually stacked one on top of the other. The uppercase held the capital letters, while the lowercase held the small letters. The names uppercase and lowercase caught on and have survived for more than 500 years. Parchment versus paper. The ancient Egyptians produced paper from the stems of the papyrus plant. Much later, the Chinese developed another way of producing paper. The Chinese method involved placing plant fibers in water to produce a pulp that could be pressed and dried into thin sheets. The art of papermaking slowly made its way across Asia into Europe. By the 1200s, there were paper mills in Spain and Italy. In medieval Europe, paper was made primarily from linen rags. The rags were repeatedly soaked in water and beaten to create a pulp of tiny linen fibers. Papermakers dipped frames made of wire mesh into the pulp to capture a thin layer of these fibers, forming a sheet of paper. The sheets were dried and pressed, and sometimes polished with a smooth stone to create a soft, shiny surface. Compared to parchment, paper was lightweight and relatively inexpensive. Paper was often used for making small volumes of sermons and low-cost textbooks, whereas high-quality books were almost always produced using parchment. However, after the invention of the printing press, paper largely replaced parchment. 2. Letters come alive. The big question? How did the printing press affect the lives of ordinary people?
"Hurry up, Jacques! We can't afford to keep Monsieur Lafarge waiting,"
came the sound of a stern voice. Jacques tried to match his father's long strides as they walked through the narrow back streets of Paris. From time to time, they came upon merchants who stood in their doorways, hawking their wares: cloth, pots and pans, leather goods, and books. As they passed a stack of books on a bookseller's table, Jacques couldn't help but stop. He ran his fingertips across the covers with their mysterious markings.
"What do you fancy, young man?" asked the shopkeeper, stepping up. "A book of prayers or stories of brave knights and their incredible adventures?"
Jacques shook his head and backed away. Even if he had a few coins, there was no point in buying books. The markings, the letters, made no sense to him. He had begged his parents to send him to school so he could learn to read and write, but there was never enough money.
"Jacques?"
His father's voice boomed out above the noise of the street. Jacques sprinted to catch up. "Sorry, Father. I was just—" said Jacques, panting as he spoke.
"You must make a good impression. A chance like this won't come again,"
his father explained. Jacques nodded as they turned a corner. He knew what an opportunity this was. His father's cousin, Lafarge, owned a printing shop, one of the newest in the city. Lafarge had agreed to take Jacques on. Jacques would be cleaning, running errands, and doing whatever he was told, but he would also get to see a printing press in action and learn how books were made. This job might even lead to an apprenticeship. The thought filled Jacques with excitement, but it terrified him too. What if reading was essential to working at the shop? What would happen if Lafarge found out that he couldn't read? Jacques tried to put that thought out of his mind as his father stopped abruptly in front of a large wooden door. Jacques' fingers tightened around the bag that contained the few possessions he owned. Gripping it with white-knuckled hands, he followed his father into the shop. Light from a number of windows lit the spacious interior. A sharp smell like paint or varnish filled the air. A dark-haired boy carried a huge stack of paper in his arms. He looked a few years older than Jacques, perhaps 16. A large desk with a slanted top stood on one side of the room. A stooped, gray-haired man stood in front of it. He was picking out small squares of metal from cases above the desk and assembling them in a long wooden tray. His fingers moved very quickly. Impressive as that was, it was the wooden contraption in the middle of the room that took Jacques' breath away. This must be the press, he thought. The new invention everyone was talking about. He'd heard rumors that it could print whole pages at a time and make many copies in minutes. Jacques thought the press looked a little like the wine presses he had seen in the countryside. It had a large, screw-like mechanism in the center and a wooden lever as thick as Jacques' arm. Two men, one tall, one short, were huddled around the press, studying something Jacques could not see. The tall man looked up and caught sight of them. He grinned broadly at Jacques' father. "Cousin!" he shouted, coming toward them. He shook hands with Jacques' father and looked down at Jacques with piercing eyes. "You would be Jacques, of course," the tall man continued. "I hope you will prove to be as good a worker as your father promised me you would be." "I will work extremely hard, monsieur," Jacques said, "at whatever task you give me." "Excellent. Now meet your fellow workers," Lafarge replied. His muscular arms swept toward the gray-haired man. "My typesetter, Henri, the best in the business," he exclaimed loudly. Turning toward the press, Lafarge gestured toward a young man and the dark-haired boy. "Philippe, my head printer, and his apprentice, Jean-Claude," Lafarge exclaimed. Then he gave a short nod, as if enough time had been wasted. "Jean-Claude will show you what to do," Lafarge concluded, before marching away. Jacques hardly had time to say goodbye to his father before Jean-Claude was leading him toward a back room. He pointed toward a corner where a broom stood beside a pail and a pile of clean rags. "Monsieur insists on a spotless shop. The rags are for cleaning type," explained Jean-Claude. Jacques wasn't sure what type was or how it was to be cleaned, but he just nodded. He didn't want to look foolish. Broom in hand, Jacques started sweeping in a far corner of the shop. As he worked, Jacques observed what was happening around him. He hoped to learn as much as he could. Each time customers came in, Lafarge rushed over to greet them. He guided them into a small office where a discussion ensued. Jacques caught snatches of conversations about books, pamphlets, law certificates, and decrees. People wanted all sorts of things printed. Jacques swept his way over to where Henri was working and watched the old man out of the corner of his eye. He had filled a large wooden frame with rows and rows of the little pieces of metal. Jacques realized they must be letters, what Jean-Claude had called type. Henri's job seemed to be to arrange the letters, the type, to form words. Obviously, Henri knew how to read. The thought made Jacques uneasy. Henri suddenly lifted up the frame full of type and spun around, nearly knocking into Jacques. "Out of the way, boy,"
the typesetter yelled. Jacques flattened himself against the nearest wall, but he watched as Philippe helped Henri set the tray of metal pieces into the press and clamp it into place. Behind them, Jean-Claude smeared what looked like shiny black paste onto a board. Ink, thought Jacques. Jean-Claude then grabbed 2 rounded balls of leather topped with handles. He pressed the balls against the plate of ink and then dabbed their blackened bottoms on the type held tightly in the frame. Jacques could see the surface of the type turn dark as the layer of ink grew thicker. Philippe stepped in, holding a large sheet of cream-colored paper by its edges. Working together, the 3 men gently fitted the paper into the press so it lay on top of the type. Then Philippe grabbed the huge lever that jutted out from the side of the press. He pulled it toward him with a powerful, even stroke. The great screw in the center of the press turned. A flat wooden board descended, pressing the paper down onto the inked type beneath it. Jacques forgot all about staying out of the way. He sensed something remarkable was about to happen. He stepped closer to the press as Philippe released the lever. Jean-Claude reached in and lifted up the paper. Perfect rows of black letters stood out against its creamy surface. Jacques thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "That's amazing," he blurted out. "It's like magic." Both Philippe and Jean-Claude grinned at him, but Henri scowled and shook his finger.
Get to work, boy. If Monsieur Lafarge sees you dawdling, you'll be out of a job, he barked.
Jacques flushed with embarrassment and went back to sweeping. Jean-Claude and Philippe seemed nice enough, but Henri obviously didn't care for him. He would need to stay out of the old man's way. Jacques grew used to the flow of the work and the captivating rhythm of the press. One printed sheet after another came to life inside it. Each sheet of paper was hung up to dry, clipped to cords that ran across the back of the shop like laundry lines. Once, when he was sure Henri was not looking, Jacques stepped up and stared closely at one. The letters were perfectly aligned and elegantly shaped. But he had no idea what was written on that beautiful page, because he didn't know which letters were which, or how they could be combined into words. He stared and stared at the mysterious shapes, feeling more hopeless than ever. When Jacques finished sweeping, he helped Jean-Claude bring in a load of paper that had just arrived. After lunch, Philippe asked him to stir a new batch of ink. The stuff was as dark and sticky as tar, but Jacques liked the smell of it.
It's made of lampblack, varnish, and egg white, Philippe explained. There's also powdered metals that help the ink to cling to the type and not spread into the fibers of the paper. Jacques stirred the ink until the muscles in his arms ached, but he forgot the pain when Philippe praised his good work. By late afternoon, Jacques was feeling good about his first day. Then suddenly, Henri called to him from across the room. Boy, come here,
he yelled. Nervously, Jacques went over and stood beside the typesetter's slanted desk.
This type needs cleaning,
Henri said, handing Jacques a basket of metal pieces thick with ink.
Wipe them until they shine.
In the back room, Jacques polished the pieces of type until they gleamed. He returned to Henri and held out the basket. "All done, sir," announced Jacques proudly. But Henri didn't take the basket. Instead, he gestured toward the many small compartments in the cases above his desk.
Put the letters back where they belong,
he ordered. Jacques' heart sank. He glanced up at the cases and then down at the basket of type in his hands. He had no idea which letters were which. He set the basket on the desk
plucked out a piece of type, and pretended to study it while shame turned his cheeks crimson. He knew the typesetter was watching him even more closely. Finally, Jacques summoned up the courage to look the old man in the eyes. "I'm sorry. I can't do it, sir," he said in a voice that was almost a whisper. Henri took the piece of type from Jacques.
"I knew that already. This was a test,"
Henri replied.
"You knew? How? I tried so hard,"
said Jacques, all the while struggling to stop his voice from trembling. The old man's reply was quiet and kind.
"Yes, you did. But when you gazed up at the drying sheets of paper, you simply stared at them. If you'd been reading the words printed on them, your eyes would have moved from side to side," he explained.
"I see,"
Jacques sighed, feeling his shoulders sag.
"And now I have failed your test as well."
"Oh no, Jacques. You passed my test quite nicely,"
said the old man with a smile. Jacques looked up sharply.
"But
he stuttered.
"You are truthful,"
Henri said, interrupting.
"That is as important as being able to read, at least as far as I am concerned."
"But I can't see how I can learn to read, sir,"
exclaimed Jacques.
"I have no money for school."
"Then it's a good thing you have me,"
Henri replied. The old man picked a piece of type from the case. He dabbed a bit of ink onto its surface and pressed it gently against the back of Jacques' hand.
"That is the letter J. It is the first letter of your name. Tomorrow you will begin learning all the others,"
he said calmly. Jacques touched the ink mark on his hand.
"Why?"
he asked.
"Why would you do this for me?"
"Because I remember how it felt not to be able to read,"
the old man replied. Then Henri put a hand on Jacques' shoulder.
"This morning, when you saw your first sheet come off the press, you said it was magic. It is, in a way. But the greater magic is reading. The ability to read will change the world. You mark my word, Jacques."
Chapter 3. Setting the Stage for Reform. The big question? Why did some people believe the church needed to be reformed during the 1400s and 1500s? Gutenberg's printing press did change the world, at least the European world. But before we talk about the changes that took place in Europe in the 1500s, let's journey further back in time. You may remember that after the fall of Rome in 476 CE, there was no longer a strong government to unite people in different countries. Instead, the Catholic Church took control. It soon became the largest and most powerful institution in Western Europe. The Church united people through a common belief in the Christian God and the Christian promise of heaven. The Church was very important to Europeans in the Middle Ages. It was the social glue that held communities together. It provided instruction on how to live in this world and how to get to the next world. The Church gave comfort and protection to those in need. The Church was also largely responsible for educating those fortunate enough to receive an education. If you had lived during this period in history, the Catholic Church would have been a major focus in your life. Typically, once a week, you would have gone to church to attend Mass. Mass is the central act of worship in the life of a Catholic. Depending on where you lived, the church you attended might have been an especially large and beautiful cathedral. Cathedrals were among the most impressive buildings in medieval Europe and would have been a constant reminder of the church's presence, power, and wealth. Most people, however, attended a much smaller local church. Latin and learning. Latin was the language of the church. The priest conducted Mass entirely in Latin. Songs sung in church by choirs, not the congregation, had Latin words. The Bible, too, was written in Latin. The problem was, only the church's clergy and the most educated people in society could speak, read, and understand Latin. For everyone else, Latin was a foreign language. Imagine going to church your entire life and never knowing exactly what was being said or sung. Since most people could not read or write, the local church was their main source of instruction with regard to church teachings. One of the most important teachings was that the church provided the only path to heaven. People who disobeyed or opposed church teachings risked punishment. If they persisted in doing something wrong, or in holding to beliefs that did not follow church doctrine and refused to recant, they could be accused of heresy. A person charged with heresy could be excommunicated. This meant that a person's membership in the Christian community was cut off, and so, people believed, was their access to heaven. In some cases, heresy was punishable by death. Growing power and influence. Throughout the Middle Ages, the power of the church continued to grow. Part of the reason behind this increasing power was money. Christians were not simply supposed to obey the church, but they were also expected to support it financially. Everyone was expected to give a portion of their yearly earnings to the church. The money, or goods such as crops and livestock, was paid like a tax and called a tithe. Over time, the church became very rich. It owned land, buildings, and even parts of towns. Wealthy people bequeathed land and money to the church. This wealth gave the Pope, who was the leader of the church, political as well as religious power. Questionable practices. For some time, the church had raised money by issuing certificates that could release or pardon people from penance. Penance was the punishment that the church taught was due after a sin was confessed and forgiven. Previously, penance had to be performed before a sin was forgiven. These certificates were called indulgences. Technically, indulgences weren't sold. They were given in exchange for donations of money. Nevertheless, the money raised by the issuing of indulgences became a huge business for the church. Many other corrupt practices also increased, such as the ability of wealthy people to buy their way into the clergy. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, religious reformers spoke out against corrupt practices in the church and demanded reform. The beginning. The word reform means to make changes to something in order to improve it. In European history, the Reformation, or the Protestant Reformation, as it is also called, was a reform movement that challenged the Catholic Church. The movement challenged the Church's teachings and authority and demanded the reform of certain practices. The Reformation began as a religious debate, but quickly grew into something much larger. It laid the foundation for what would eventually become known as Protestantism, one of the three major branches of Christianity. The other branch of Christianity, the Orthodox Church, was formed hundreds of years earlier. Now, the Reformation would bring about Protestantism. In addition, the Reformation led to great political and social change throughout much of Europe. One reformer in particular helped usher in the Reformation. His name was Martin Luther. Luther was a German monk and a devout Catholic. Yet the corruption he saw in the church, along with his personal ideas about salvation, turned him against it. Luther's dispute with the church succeeded, at least in part, because of the printing press. Shifts in power. As a result of the Reformation, Europe experienced unrest, persecution,
and several wars. However, Europe emerged from this period in history as a very different place. In some countries, religious reform was accompanied by political reform. A number of European monarchs challenged age-old traditions of power in relation to the church. They seized and then redistributed power, shifting it from the church and its leader, the Pope, to the state. This shift in power made monarchs more powerful. Over time, new forms of government were created in which more people had a voice. In time, the Catholic Church listened to the critics and began to reform itself from within. It became a more unified institution, despite having lost some of its political influence. To a large extent, much of Northern Europe and England became a stronghold of Protestantism. However, most other Western European states remained Catholic. As a result, European society was divided along religious lines in a way it had never been before. These divisions would continue to shape European history for many years to come. Against this backdrop, scientific advances were being made. Scientists such as Nicolaus Copernicus and Galileo Galilei made discoveries that led them to reject the long-held belief that Earth lay at the center of the universe. Instead, they proposed a new view of the solar system, with the Sun and not Earth at its center. Of princes and Protestants. When many people hear the word Protestant, they think about Martin Luther and other religious reformers of the Reformation. However, the word actually originated as a result of several German princes protesting a ruling by the Church that Luther be arrested and punished for his rebellious actions and ideas. These princes were the original Protestants. Over time, however, the term came to be associated with religious reformers like Luther, who protested against certain teachings and practices of the Church during the Reformation. And rebirth. As you know, the Renaissance was a cultural movement in Europe characterized by renewed interest in ancient Greek and Roman civilization and learning. This revival of ancient ideas and ideals, the word Renaissance means rebirth, took hold during the latter part of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance sparked enormous creativity and experimentation in European art, literature, architecture, music, and science. The Renaissance got its start in the Italian city of Florence. In time, however, the focus shifted from Florence to Rome, where the Church had its papal offices, or headquarters. From about 1450 CE onward, one pope after another decided to support great Renaissance artists and architects, just like the wealthy residents of Florence did. The popes called artists to Rome and set them to work creating some of the most magnificent paintings, sculptures, and buildings of all time. The popes justified these artistic undertakings by claiming that when people saw majestic buildings, gorgeous paintings, and beautiful sculptures, they would be in awe. They would ponder the glory of God. They would also appreciate the splendor and power of the Church and be thankful to be a part of it. But its power and role in people's lives was about to be seriously threatened. Chapter 4. The Reformation Movement. The big question? What did Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others contribute to the Reformation movement? Martin Luther sparked the Reformation, a movement that brought about great religious and political changes. As a young boy growing up in Germany, he could not have known that he would be responsible for such change. Martin Luther was born into a relatively wealthy German family. His father prospered in the copper mining business. His family had enough money to send him to good schools and eventually to the University of Erfurt, one of the best universities in Germany. Luther was an excellent student and earned 2 degrees.
In 1505 CE, at age 21, he decided to pursue a third degree in law. But 6 weeks later, he had a sudden change of heart. What happened? As Luther later told the story, he was walking home one night when a terrible storm came. Thunder boomed and lightning blazed across the sky. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck dangerously close, knocking Luther to the ground. As the storm raged around him, the terrified Luther vowed that if he survived, he would give his life to God and become a monk. Luther did survive. True to his promise, but much to his father's dismay, he stopped studying law and entered the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt. Growing doubts. Like most Christians of his time, Luther initially accepted what the church taught. The only way into heaven was to do good works, aid the poor, confess his sins, and follow its teachings. But during the years Luther spent in the monastery at Erfurt, he had a lot of time to read the Bible. He pondered biblical passages, as well as his own beliefs. Like most people of this age, Luther wanted to ensure for himself a place in heaven. He began to question, however, the church's teachings with regard to what people had to do to make that happen. He also questioned the role of priests in people's lives. His views were a direct challenge to the church in Rome. Luther's 95 Theses. After several years, Luther was transferred from Erfurt to a monastery at Wittenberg. There, Luther attended the University of Wittenberg. He earned an advanced degree in biblical theology and became a teacher at the university. Luther was a gifted teacher and a powerful speaker. As he continued teaching, he struggled to come to a clearer understanding of his own beliefs and how they differed from church teachings. He was angered by practices within the church that he thought were corrupt. In 1517 CE, an event took place that changed Luther's life and ultimately European history. If you recall, the church raised money by issuing indulgences. People believed that indulgences could speed up their journey to heaven and shorten the amount of time they spent in purgatory, a place people believed their souls went before reaching heaven. The practice of issuing indulgences in exchange for money became intolerable for Luther when he heard about a Dominican friar named John Tetzel. Tetzel not only issued indulgences, he proclaimed that as soon as a coin was received by the church, a soul was released from purgatory. It was essentially saying you could buy the way of a soul into heaven. Outraged, Luther decided to act. He composed a list of 95 objections to the practice of issuing indulgences and sent it in a letter to his superiors. In addition, on October 31st, 1517 CE, Luther nailed a copy of this list, later called his 95 Theses, to the door of the church at the University of Wittenberg. This action was an open invitation to discuss and debate his point of view. Another storm brewing. Luther was trying to start a discussion with his theses, not a revolution. But people who were unhappy with the church were energized by Luther's actions. Luther's theses were quickly translated from Latin into German, and, thanks to the printing press, thousands of copies were distributed across Europe in just a few months. Encouraged, Luther began speaking out more openly against other church teachings. He also wrote essays in which he discussed the importance of faith and the fact that all believers, wealthy or poor, were equal. These writings, including On Christian Liberty, On the Freedom of a Christian Man, and An Open Letter to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, were also translated, printed, and widely distributed across Europe. As you can imagine, not everyone was pleased about the stir Luther was causing. In 1518 CE, the Pope summoned Luther to Rome
to explain his actions. Fortunately for Luther, Frederick III, the Elector or ruler of Saxony, intervened. Frederick was in a tricky position. He had received a letter from the Pope urging him to turn Luther over to the church officials in Rome. Frederick didn't necessarily agree with Luther's ideas on religion. However, as ruler of the region in which Luther lived, he didn't like the Pope telling his subjects what to do either. In fact, Frederick wanted to increase the power of the German nobility. Not only that, he was tired of sending German money to Rome to pay for perceived papal extravagance. He also suspected that Luther, a German, would not be treated fairly in Rome. Instead of sending Luther to Rome, Frederick had his hearing moved to a city in southern Germany. There, Luther was questioned by church officials about his beliefs. He refused to change his mind. Luther's refusal to back down made the Pope even angrier. In 1520 CE, the Pope issued an official document called a papal bull. In his bull, the Pope attacked Luther and said his writings were those of a heretic. Luther was ordered to recant or take back all that he'd said about the Church and its teachings. A papal what? Important orders issued by the Pope were written on parchment and sealed with a lump of lead. To make the document official, the Pope pressed his signet ring into the lump of metal while it was still warm and soft. The lead lump was called a bulla in Latin, which is why these papal documents came to be called bulls. How did Luther respond? On December 10, 1520 CE, students, professors, and some of the townspeople of Wittenberg gathered before a blazing bonfire. They watched as Martin Luther defiantly dropped a copy of the papal bull into the blaze. In doing so, Luther was publicly defying the Pope. It was a bold and dangerous move. A month later, the Pope formally labeled Luther a heretic and excommunicated him from the Church. Refusal and refuge. Many Germans, including some German noblemen, did not think Luther had been given a fair hearing. In 1521 CE, Luther was ordered to appear before a special assembly called a Diet in the German city of Worms. The Diet of Worms included knights, church officials, and representatives from various towns and regions. When Luther arrived, he thought he would get a chance to defend his ideas. Instead, church officials piled his writings in front of him and again ordered him to denounce his ideas. Luther refused. The Diet of Worms declared Luther to be not just a heretic, but also a criminal. Since it was common to kill heretics and criminals, Luther's life was in danger. Once again, Frederick III of Saxony came to his aid. As Luther traveled back to Wittenberg, the Elector arranged for masked horsemen to pretend to kidnap Luther. Frederick did not believe Luther was guilty of any crime that warranted death. He was also well aware that Luther had gained the support of many of Frederick's own subjects. Luther was whisked off to a castle where he remained in hiding and under Frederick's protection for 10 months. During that time, Luther began translating the New Testament into German, setting a style of language that was more accessible to people. By the time Luther came out of hiding, his push for reform had turned into a religious and political movement that had been greatly strengthened. The power of the printing press was evident as his ideas and beliefs spread far and wide. Those people who believed in his ideas left the Catholic Church and began to worship according to Luther's teachings. Luther and Erasmus. Martin Luther continued to write about his religious ideas for the rest of his life. In the 1520s, he got into a debate with Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch Renaissance humanist and scholar. Renaissance humanists emphasized learning and scholarship and the ability of human beings to figure out for themselves what is true and important in life. Like Luther, Erasmus wanted to see reform in the Catholic Church. Unlike Luther, he did not break away from the Church and respected many of its teachings and traditions. In their writings, the two men debated many topics, including what free will was and whether human beings have it. Were people free to choose to be good or not? Other Protestant reformers. Martin Luther set the Reformation in motion. Other religious reformers soon followed. Each reformer had his own ideas and his own vision of reform. Each gained his own set of followers. Disputes, even fighting, arose between some of these groups. One radical sect, labeled Anabaptists by those who viewed them negatively, took control of the city of Munster, Germany in 1534 CE. This sect established an independent community, or commune of believers. They set themselves apart from the world that existed outside the city walls. A Dutch tailor declared himself king of the community. In some ways, they were social rebels, challenging the social order. The Munster Rebellion, as it was later known, didn't last much more than a year. The Anabaptists were either executed or forced out of the city. But it was a sign of how the Reformation was changing not only people's religious beliefs, but their ideas about politics and governments too. One of the most influential religious reformers, in addition to Luther, was a Frenchman named John Calvin. Calvin settled in Switzerland in the city of Geneva. His ideas and teachings attracted many followers, and soon Geneva became the center of the religious reform movement known as Calvinism. Calvin was opposed to many of the traditions and teachings of the Catholic Church. He believed that if the Bible did not specifically tell you to do something in a church service, then you shouldn't do it. He also believed in predestination. This is the belief that some people have already been chosen by God for salvation. Those chosen, said Calvin, would lead a simple, self-disciplined life, devoted to God. Calvinist churches were very plain and bare, with no stained glass windows, no statues of saints, and no paintings. Calvin also stressed social reform. He worked for better hospitals and special care for the poor and needy. He also started a school called the Geneva Academy. Graduates of the academy traveled to many countries, including France, the Netherlands, Scotland, and England, where they spread Calvinist beliefs to new groups. In England, one such group was the Puritans. They brought Calvin's ideas with them when they journeyed to New England in the early 1600s and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Chapter 5. What is the center of the universe? The big question? What new scientific theories were proposed by Nicolaus Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, and Galileo Galilei, and how did the Church respond? You've probably seen the sun rise and set many times. You've noticed how it slowly moves across the sky during the day. Well, at least it seems to move. If you've paid attention during science, you know that the sun doesn't orbit Earth. Earth orbits or travels around the sun, as do other planets in our solar system. Earth also spins as it orbits the sun. It's because Earth is spinning that the sun appears to move across the sky every day. But imagine not knowing any of that. Imagine trying to explain the relationship between the Earth and the sun based only on what you could see by looking up at the sky. If you think about it that way, it's easy to understand why people in centuries past arrived at other conclusions. The idea that the Earth is at the center of things is called the geocentric model of the universe. At the beginning of the Reformation, this is what almost everyone in Europe believed to be true. The Catholic Church also supported this geocentric view. But the Reformation was a time when many people were questioning long-held beliefs. Martin Luther and other Protestant reformers were challenging religious beliefs. Scientifically minded reformers were looking hard at the geocentric model of the universe, and they were discovering that it, too, needed to be challenged. From Earth-centered to sun-centered, Ptolemy and Copernicus. The idea that the Earth was at the center of the universe seems to have had its start in ancient Greece. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote about it as early as the 4th century BCE. During the 2nd century CE, a Greek astronomer and mathematician named Claudius Ptolemy expanded on Aristotle's ideas. In fact, the geocentric model is sometimes called the Ptolemaic model. Ptolemy supported Aristotle's view that Earth stood still at the center of the universe, while the sun, moon, and planets all revolved around it. He thought these heavenly bodies were located in different spheres, something like gigantic crystal-clear bubbles, with the bigger spheres around the smaller spheres, and Earth at the very center. For many hundreds of years, people accepted Ptolemy's model of the universe. No one questioned his views. No one, that is, until a Polish astronomer named Nicolaus Copernicus came along. Copernicus was born in 1473 CE in the Polish city of Thorn, now called Torun. In the early 1500s, about the time Martin Luther was forming his religious beliefs, Copernicus was studying the movements of the planets and stars. He made all his observations with the naked eye, because the telescope hadn't been invented. What Copernicus observed happening in the heavens, however, didn't really match Ptolemy's geocentric model. He concluded that Ptolemy and the ancients were wrong. Earth does not sit still at the center of the universe. Instead, Earth and other planets revolve around the sun. Copernicus's findings supported a heliocentric rather than a geocentric view of the universe. Copernicus had made a great discovery, but he did not run out and shout it from the rooftops. In fact, he kept quiet about his work. Why? For one thing, he did not have enough evidence to prove his ideas beyond all doubt. Copernicus may also have feared what would happen to him if he publicly contradicted the Church's beliefs about the nature of the universe and the Earth's place in it. It wasn't until 1543 CE, at the very end of his life, that Copernicus published his findings in a book called On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres. According to some accounts, Copernicus was handed the first printed copy of his book while on his deathbed. Once again, the power of printing helped to spread new ideas, this time in the area of science. Initially, Copernicus's heliocentric model did not get much attention or cause much disturbance, but a handful of European astronomers believed that Copernicus was onto something. Greek roots. The word geocentric comes from the Greek words geo, which means the earth, and kentrikos, which means as or of the center. So geocentric means having the earth as the center. Helios is the Greek word for sun, so heliocentric means having the sun as the center. Johannes Kepler. German mathematician and astronomer Johannes Kepler was one of these people. While studying at the University of Tübingen in the 1590s, Kepler's mathematics professor introduced him to Copernicus's heliocentric theory. Being a mathematician, Kepler was able to understand and appreciate Copernicus's observations and calculations. Over the next few years, Kepler pursued his own studies of the night sky, eventually publishing a book, Mysterium Cosmographicum, or the Cosmographic Mystery. In this book, he presented a mathematical model
that explained the relative distances of the planets from the Sun based on his and Copernicus's observations. Kepler's book impressed another astronomer, Tycho Brahe. In 1600 CE, Brahe invited Kepler to come to Prague to help him calculate planetary orbits. Within a year, Brahe died, and Kepler took over the work. Kepler continued his astronomical observations and eventually formulated theories about the way the different planets orbit the Sun. These theories later came to be called Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Most of Kepler's contemporaries had not changed their thinking, which is why Kepler was so excited when he learned about the discoveries of Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei. Galileo and the telescope. Born in Pisa, Italy in 1564 CE, Galileo Galilei, many people refer to him just by his first name, Galileo, started his career thinking he might become a doctor. At the age of 17, Galileo headed off to the University of Pisa with that plan in mind. But after only a couple of years, he left medical school to study and then later teach mathematics. Galileo was a brilliant mathematician. He made many calculations and discoveries about how objects move. As a well-educated man, he was very familiar with the writings of Aristotle and Ptolemy and the geocentric model of the universe. But he had also read Copernicus's book. Like Copernicus, however, Galileo recognized that no one had yet found conclusive proof that Earth and the other planets orbited the Sun. At the time, Galileo was more interested in explaining how things worked on Earth rather than out in space. But within a few years, his interest changed thanks to a new invention. In 1608 CE, a Dutch glassmaker named Hans Lippershey constructed one of the first telescopes. Galileo learned about the invention and very quickly improved on the design. Within a year, he was using a telescope to scan the night sky. He saw much that directly contradicted the ideas of Aristotle and Ptolemy. These ancient scholars had believed that all heavenly bodies were perfect, with smooth, unmarked surfaces. But through his telescope, Galileo saw that the moon's surface was rough and uneven, marked with mountains, valleys, and craters. Aristotle and Ptolemy also believed the knowledge of the heavens was complete. In other words, what they could see was what existed. With his telescope, Galileo discovered 4 new moons orbiting Jupiter. In 1610 CE, Galileo published a book, Sidereus Nuncius, or The Starry Messenger, in which he described what he had seen through his telescope. These discoveries clearly contradicted the geocentric model of the universe, and that made quite a few people nervous. Several church scholars went so far as to say that Galileo's findings couldn't possibly be true. Yet as use of the telescope spread, other scientists in other countries, including Kepler, made similar observations of Earth's moon and the moons of Jupiter. Encouraged, Galileo continued to study the night sky with his telescope, making discoveries and writing and speaking about them. Although Galileo was a devout Catholic, he didn't think his findings challenged the Church or the Bible. He thought science and religion answered different questions. He said the purpose of the Bible was to show how one goes to heaven, not how the heavens go. But that's not how the church scholars felt who had spoken out against Galileo earlier. They labeled him a heretic and encouraged priests and monks to condemn him. Soon, much more powerful members of the church began to speak against Galileo as well. Galileo wrote letters and gave speeches in order to defend himself, his findings, and Copernicus's views, but things only got worse. Almost silenced. In 1615 CE, the Inquisition, or the court of the Catholic Church, discussed Galileo and the ideas of Copernicus for over 2 months. The judges, called inquisitors, decided that Copernicus's ideas went against church teachings. They ordered Galileo to stop promoting the idea that the earth moves rather than the sun. Galileo realized that he risked imprisonment or worse if he continued. Keeping quiet was much safer and would also enable him to continue working in private. Galileo decided to keep quiet and did so for several years. However, when a new pope, Urban VIII, came into power, Galileo hoped that this new man with new ideas would listen to him. In 1624 CE, Galileo asked the Pope for permission to write a book that would discuss the ocean tides in relation to the contrasting ideas of Ptolemy and Copernicus. The Pope gave Galileo permission to write the book as long as he treated the ideas of Copernicus as speculation, not as truth. Galileo wrote the book as he wanted to, titling it Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. The Inquisition was not pleased. Galileo was summoned to Rome to stand trial and was accused of being a heretic. In order to spare himself punishment and possible execution, Galileo eventually recanted. But astronomers and mathematicians who came after him found more and more evidence that Galileo, Kepler, and Copernicus were correct. Around the middle of the 1700s, the Church began to change its position, acknowledging the huge body of evidence supporting motion of the planets around the Sun. Chapter 6. The Catholic Church Responds. The big question: how did the Catholic Church respond to the Protestant Reformation movement? In the early 1500s, probably no one, not even Martin Luther, imagined how much Europe would change as a result of the Reformation. But as the religious reform movement gained strength, many people left the Catholic Church and embraced the teachings of various Protestant reformers. Before Luther wrote his 95 Theses, Western Europe had been largely united by a single religion, Catholicism. After Luther, Northern and Northwestern Europe became strongholds for Lutheran, Calvinist, and other Protestant believers. Southern Europeans, especially those in Spain, France, and Italy, remained primarily Catholic. By the 1530s, Europe was deeply divided by religion. As the number of converts to Protestantism grew, leaders in the Catholic Church realized they needed to take action. The Catholic Church's response to the Reformation is called the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation. It opposed or countered the Protestant-driven Reformation. Several popes were involved with the Catholic Reformation, but the man who started things moving was Pope Paul III. The Catholic Reformation gets underway. In 1536 CE, Pope Paul III appointed a group of cardinals to investigate what was right and wrong with the Church. The cardinals identified many problems. These included corrupt practices such as issuing indulgences for money. Their findings also revealed a relatively uneducated priesthood and monasteries and religious orders that were not following church teachings. After considering the cardinals' report, the Pope and his advisors laid down plans for reform. They decided to focus on weeding out corrupt practices within the Church. They saw the need to more clearly state Catholic beliefs and teachings. They also hoped to halt the spread of Protestantism and bring former Catholics back into the faith. The goals seemed clear. Now the challenge was to accomplish them. Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuits. One of the first things Pope Paul III did was to encourage new religious orders within the Church to help promote reform. Perhaps the most influential of these Catholic organizations was the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, as they were also known. Ignatius of Loyola,
a Spanish priest, had founded the Jesuits several years earlier. Ignatius had taken a long and unusual path to the priesthood. Born in 1491 CE, the year before Christopher Columbus sailed for the New World, he had spent his early adult years in the Spanish military. While defending a Spanish fort from an invading French army, Ignatius was hit by a cannonball. The cannonball shattered the bones in one of his legs. His recovery was slow and painful. He was forced to spend a lot of time lying down while his leg healed. To pass the days, Ignatius read. However, the only available reading materials in the place where he was recovering were religious books. There was an illustrated book that told the story of Christ's life and a book about Catholic saints. As Ignatius read, he felt he was being called by God to a new life of good works. After his leg healed, he left the military and studied to become a priest. While studying for the priesthood, Ignatius kept detailed journals in which he wrote about the challenges of his new calling. Later in life, he turned his journals into an inspirational text called Spiritual Exercises, complete with prayers and meditations. Ignatius thought the book might help guide others on their own spiritual journeys. Spiritual Exercises became quite popular and was translated into many different languages. Ignatius was elected the first leader of the Society of Jesus after it officially became a Catholic religious order. He counseled his fellow Jesuits to serve without hard words or contempt for people's errors. Ignatius died in 1556 CE. He was declared a saint by the Catholic Church in the early 1600s, and so became Saint Ignatius of Loyola. How did the Jesuits help the Catholic Reformation? They worked to revive Catholicism in Europe and spread the faith to the New World. The members of the Jesuit order were well educated. They were dedicated to teaching as well as preaching, and they built many schools and universities. Jesuits became tutors to the children of princes and noblemen in many European countries. Jesuits traveled far and wide as missionaries, bringing education and Catholic beliefs to the Americas and parts of Asia. Although the Catholic Church had lost power and influence in Europe during the Reformation, the Jesuits helped the Church regain some of what had been lost. They also helped the Church grow in parts of the world beyond Europe. Council of Trent. In 1545 CE, Pope Paul III sent out a papal bull summoning the Catholic bishops of Europe to Trento, a city in what is now northern Italy. There they met to discuss and decide how best to reform the Church. The Council of Trent, as it came to be called, was the Catholic Church's organized response to the Reformation. The Council of Trent met in 3 separate sessions between 1545 and 1563 CE. The Council issued formal declarations that explained why the Church disagreed with the teachings of Protestant reformers. They clarified the doctrines that formed the basis of the Catholic faith. They affirmed that Church traditions, as well as the Bible, were the foundation of Catholic beliefs. The Council also took steps to reform corrupt practices within the Church by issuing a number of reform decrees. Decisions made by the Council played a key role in revitalizing and unifying the Catholic Church. Some parts of Europe that had turned to Protestantism, including Austria, Poland, and a part of Germany, called Bavaria, reverted back to Catholicism. Other actions of the Council. In Chapter 1, you read about Johann Gutenberg and the invention of a printing press. By the early 1500s, hundreds of thousands of books and pamphlets were in print and being read by Europeans. Leaders of the Catholic Church recognized the power of the printed word. In an attempt to stop the spread of anti-Catholic writings, the Council of Trent decided to try to control what Catholics were allowed to read. The council had church leaders review new publications. If those materials went against church teachings, they were censored. Furthermore, the council created the Index of Forbidden Books, a list of publications that were banned or forbidden. By creating the index, the Church hoped to keep heretical or what they considered immoral writings from corrupting the minds of its faithful followers. Nearly all books written by Protestants were banned. Even the writings of some reform-minded Catholics, such as Desiderius Erasmus, were banned as well. Anyone caught reading, selling, or owning a banned book faced punishment. Pope Paul III also revived the Inquisition as part of the Church's response to the Reformation. As you have discovered, the Inquisition was the court system of the Catholic Church. It was tasked with rooting out heresy. The Index of Forbidden Books and the Inquisition were the two primary tools that the Church used to counteract Protestant ideas. Results of the Reformations. By the second half of the 1500s, many of the problems in the Catholic Church that had triggered the Reformation had been corrected or greatly reduced. The Council of Trent had purged the Church, leaving it stronger and more united. However, it was clear that Catholic and Protestant sects, though now reconciled on some issues, would never be united again. The Reformation and the Catholic Reformation left Christians in Europe bitterly divided. In Catholic-controlled areas, Protestants were persecuted as heretics. In Protestant strongholds, Catholics were persecuted with equal brutality. Some conflicts flared into terrible wars that lasted many years. In fact, these two religious reformations sparked many years of warfare in Europe. But there were also positive outcomes as a result of these two reform movements. Ordinary people, not just the wealthy nobility, had access to Bibles and other texts that were printed in their native language. To some extent, people had a choice about which religion they could follow. They were able to associate more freely with others who shared the same beliefs. Kings gained greater control over their kingdoms, and over time, their subjects began to identify more with countries and empires rather than with a particular religion. Erasmus and the Reformation. When I get a little money, I buy books. If any is left, I buy food and clothes. Did that quotation make you chuckle? Did it also make you think? Could books and learning be more important than what a person eats or wears? A man named Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, 1466 to 1536 CE, penned that quotation around 1500 CE. The statement is typical of Erasmus. He spent his life writing books and essays that often seemed funny at first glance, yet they expressed ideas that challenged readers to think deeply about serious subjects. Erasmus was a Dutch theologian and scholar with a tremendous talent for writing about important subjects related to society and religion. Erasmus played an important role in the Reformation. Monk turned scholar. Erasmus was born in Rotterdam, Netherlands. His early education began in monastic schools, where it was assumed he would grow up to become a monk. In his early 20s, Erasmus took the vows necessary to become a monk and soon after was admitted to the Catholic priesthood. However, monastic life didn't suit him. He left after only a few years to begin a career doing what he loved most: learning, reading, and writing. Erasmus pored over the works of ancient scholars from Greece and Rome, as well as the writings of contemporary thinkers. He traveled widely and became acquainted with intellectuals throughout Europe. He was a keen observer and soon devoted himself to writing about the problems of his day. At the beginning of the 1500s, many of those problems had to do with the Catholic Church. Erasmus was a devout Catholic and respected the Catholic faith, but he was dismayed by the corruption and abusive use of power he saw among some church leaders.
Erasmus's goal was to use the power of the written word to stimulate church reform. In his writings, he urged Catholics to more closely follow the examples and teachings of Jesus. He stressed focusing less on rituals and ceremonies and more on the religious meaning behind them. He felt that Christians should not obey church leaders blindly. Instead, they should study Jesus' life and teachings by reading the Bible themselves. By advocating these ideas, Erasmus paved the way for Luther and other Protestant reformers. Unlike Luther and those who followed him, however, Erasmus never tried to break away from the Catholic Church. He hoped to improve it from within, peacefully and thoughtfully. A New Bible. Erasmus wanted words to promote religious reform. It seems fitting that one of his greatest contributions to the Reformation was his translation of the New Testament. For more than 1,000 years, the Church had been using what was called the Vulgate Bible. It had been written during the 300s in Latin by a scholar named Eusebius Hieronymus, or Saint Jerome, as he was later known. In Jerome's day, there were many versions of the Bible circulating in the Christian world. Some were quite different from others. Jerome was tasked by the Pope with producing one standardized Latin Bible to help support a universal church doctrine. Jerome used ancient Latin, Greek, and Hebrew manuscripts to produce his Latin translation of the Bible. During the early 1500s, Erasmus studied the original Greek manuscripts on which the Vulgate Bible was based. He discovered that Jerome's translation had flaws. Erasmus wanted to correct the errors. Around 1514 CE, Erasmus moved to Basel, now in Switzerland, but then part of the German Empire, which had become a hub for printing. Basel was home to some of the best printing presses and book publishers in Europe. Erasmus had been working on a new Greek translation of the New Testament, based on original manuscripts. In 1516 CE, he published a New Testament that was unlike anything Christians had seen before. On each page, one column had the text in Greek, while the second column was in Latin. The basis for the Latin text was the Vulgate Bible, but Erasmus had edited it to more closely match the meaning of the original Greek manuscripts. Erasmus's New Testament was the product of the most scholarly study of the Bible that anyone had ever undertaken in Europe. He published a second edition in 1519 CE, in which the Latin text was largely his own elegant translation. Erasmus's New Testament became immensely popular in Europe and made him famous. The Catholic Church embraced it. It didn't hurt that Erasmus dedicated the first edition to Pope Leo X. Along with some of Erasmus's other writings, his New Testament also served as a source of inspiration for the first Protestant reformer, Martin Luther. Other translations of the Bible. Martin Luther thought Erasmus's New Testament was wonderful. Luther used it as the primary source for his translation of the New Testament into German. A few years later, William Tyndale used it as the basis for his translation of the New Testament into English. Caught in the middle. After the publication of his New Testament, Erasmus became one of the most widely known and influential scholars in Western Europe. At roughly the same time, Martin Luther's outspoken criticisms of the Church set the Reformation in motion. As the movement spread, Luther and his supporters called on Erasmus to join their cause. They had read Erasmus's criticisms of the Church and his writings that urged Christians to more closely follow Christ's biblical teachings. The religious reformers assumed that Erasmus would support them in their break with the Church. But he didn't. Erasmus preferred not to take sides in the conflict he could see was developing. He declined Luther's repeated requests that he openly join the reformers' cause. He thought Luther's break from the Church could only lead to trouble. The more Luther insisted, the more firmly Erasmus refused.
the two men never met face to face to discuss the matter. Instead, they sent letters to each other and to others involved in the debate. Throughout these written exchanges, Erasmus remained polite. He wrote about Luther, "I shall not write against him. I have taught well nigh all that Luther teaches, only less violently. I hope that all the tumult Luther has stirred up will, like a drastic medicine, somehow bring about the health of the Church." Luther wasn't nearly as kind when expressing his opinion of Erasmus. In a letter to another reformer, he wrote, "Erasmus might have been of great service, but he is the worst foe of Christ that has arisen in the last 1,000 years." When it became known that Erasmus wouldn't join the Protestants, many Catholics tried to claim him as their champion instead. Several Catholic scholars and church leaders demanded that Erasmus denounce Luther. They insisted that he make it clear that he favored Catholic doctrines over Protestant teachings. Again, Erasmus refused to take sides. This made the Catholics angry. They claimed Erasmus was being disloyal to his faith. Erasmus was caught in the middle of the Protestant-Catholic controversy. He realized that, to some degree, his writings about church reform had helped start the Reformation. When Catholics accused Erasmus of having laid the egg that Luther hatched, he admitted they were partially correct. But he added that he had expected quite another kind of bird to hatch from that egg. In other words, although he agreed with some of Luther's ideas and teachings, he thought others were too extreme. Growing divisions. Erasmus could sense the tensions rising on both sides in the Reformation. He abhorred violence. As the Reform movement gained momentum, Erasmus was saddened to see its religious discussions and debates turn into persecution, angry division, and bitter conflicts. Over the next few years, he did his best to stay out of the way. When Protestants took control of Basil's city government in 1529 CE, Erasmus felt morally obligated to leave. He objected to living where Catholic worship was now legally and forcefully suppressed. Furthermore, Erasmus had always said his quarrel was not with the Catholic Church itself, but only with corruption and practices he felt were wrong. He remained faithful to the Catholic Church throughout his life. Erasmus took up residence in a German town that was not in danger of being taken over by Protestants. He continued to write, but his works were widely criticized by both Catholics and Protestants because he still refused to denounce one side over the other. Some of Erasmus's last writings advocated mutual tolerance between Catholics and Protestants. Neither side paid much attention to him. In 1535 CE, Erasmus was putting the final touches on what would be the last edition of his famous New Testament. Despite the fact that Basel was still a Protestant city, he moved back there to be closer to his publisher. Although very ill, he wanted to oversee the printing of one of his life's greatest achievements. Erasmus died in July 1556 CE. He left behind quite a large sum of money. He had sold a lot of books. Some of it was used to publish a collection of his writings, 9 large volumes in all. The rest Erasmus had requested go to providing support for girls from poor families and students at the University of Basel. Looking out for Luther. Luther's words against Erasmus seem awfully harsh, considering that when Luther was labeled a heretic by the Church, Erasmus took steps that likely saved Luther's life. Erasmus wrote to Frederick III of Saxony, the German elector who ruled over the region where Luther lived. In the letter, Erasmus said that, in his opinion, Luther was not a heretic. He urged Frederick to protect Luther and make sure he didn't fall into the hands of his enemies, for they would likely kill him. Frederick took Erasmus's advice and made sure that Luther remained safe. Luther knew about the letter.